And let me also thank Congressman Nadler for welcoming us to his district. Thank you. This hearing continues our informal roundtable discussion yesterday on Amtrak, and will hopefully reinforce the idea that investment in the Northeast Corridor is a priority. Last week in California, we learned a lot about California high-speed rail program. We also learned how the first $6 billion in state and federal funding the project received will go to upgrade current Amtrak service in the valley. The Northeast Corridor is the most highly trafficked rail corridor in the country, and Amtrak's sole money-making enterprise. Infrastructure upgrades in this corridor are essential to continue to serve a proven and dedicated ridership that continues to expand. I believe the $6 billion that was given to California high-speed rail could be better spent on such upgrades, as these projects are where they're both clearly identified and necessary beyond dispute. To place $6 billion in perspective, this amount of money is enough to replace the Baltimore and Potomac tunnels, which is $1.5 billion, build a new Portal South Bridge with a 4-track alignment into New York. That's $1 billion with 150,000 daily riders. We could replace the century-old Susquehanna River Bridge, $800 million, and replace the Gunpowder River Bridge, $600 million, with $2 billion left over. We saw all these projects yesterday, and obviously they are a challenge to deal with, and they certainly slow down the commute time. These are just a few examples on a list of over $30 billion in identified projects. Each would substantially decrease trip times along the corridor by eliminating significant bottlenecks. Given that there are over 11.4 million Amtrak riders and over 200 million commuters that use the Northeast Corridor every year, it would be an investment in an area where we have proven ridership. Furthermore, there are still questions in California as to whether the improvements made by the authority will even be used by Amtrak or even improve ridership as stations move from city centers to the outskirts. Simply put, this money would have been better spent here on the Northeast Corridor, which continues to surpass ridership and revenue records for Amtrak. Also, unlike most other Amtrak services, the Northeast Corridor consistently turns an operating profit. I believe more investment must be made in the Northeast Corridor for continued success in the future, but when there was funding available, it was spent elsewhere. Indeed, the Northeast Corridor did not receive any of the President's high-speed rail money until after the states returned theirs. Clearly, this was not a priority. We've got to prioritize, fix it first, and address known problems, and our current policy structure does not encourage this. Finally, with a year of trillion-dollar deficits, federal resources are scarce, and we've got to continue to work within existing funding levels. We've got to find ways to work with the private sector as well. Let me again thank our witnesses for being here today. We're open to all discussions, all suggestions, and I look forward to hearing from our witnesses. I'd now like to recognize Ranking Member Corinne Brown from Florida for 5 minutes to make any opening statements she may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having this hearing here at the Northeast Corridor, the backbone of our nation passenger rail system. I want to thank Mr. Nadler for welcoming us to his district. We're physically in his district, and I want people to know who I am. I'm Congresswoman Corinne Brown from Florida. I have already donated $500 million when my governor sent $3 billion back, and I understand that you all have $500 million, so I am a contributor to the Northeast Corridor already. More than 2,200 trains travel the corridor daily, only 157 of which are Amtrak trains that transport about 16 million annual passengers. The commuters and freight railroads make up the rest of the trains on the corridor. I don't know if we have ever driven up I-95 to New York, but it is much better to do it by train. I'm sure that many of you remember the Northeast Corridor Improvement Project in the early 1980s, which modernized a number of facilities on the corridor. From 1990 to 2002, however, very little investments was made in the corridor. In 2003, things began to change with a new emphasis placed on bringing Amtrak equipment and infrastructure closer to the state-of-art good repair. Amtrak began a process of ramping up a significant capital program and have since made substantial progress in addressing the backlog of capital needs throughout its system. In 2008, Congress charted a new course for passenger rail in the United States with the enactment of the bipartisan legislation, the Passenger Rail Investment and Improvement Act. That law created a new national program for the development of high-speed rail and inner-city passenger rail in the United States, which later led to a significant federal investment in the corridor throughout the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009. Some of those funds enabled Amtrak to replace a 100-year-old bridge in Connecticut. The law also established the Northeast Corridor Infrastructure and Operational Advisory Commission to help develop a long-term vision and investment strategies for the corridors. The law also reenacted Amtrak through the end of this fiscal year. It is my hope that as we look forward to the reauthorization of Amtrak, that we build on the success of the act and continue to increase investment in Amtrak and the states. In fact, I support the President's fiscal year 2014 budget proposed to create a dedicated funding source for Amtrak, which would enable Amtrak to better budget its needs, including major infrastructure improvement. The fact is, over the last 50 years, the federal government has invested nearly $1.3 trillion in our nation highways and more than $484 billion in aviation. But only since 1970, when Congress created Amtrak, did we begin to invest in passenger rail. Since that time, we have invested just $67 billion in passenger rail, on a small fraction of what the European and Asian countries have invested. In closing, let me just say that I want to particularly give a special salute to Mr. Boardman for joining us and for helping to organize this hearing. And I am really pleased that they've extended your contract. You've done a superb job working with all of the elements that you have to work with. Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, I look forward to hearing from the witnesses.
Thank you. I now call on the full committee chairman, Mr. Shuster, for any opening statement he may have.
Thank you very much. It's great to be in New York City. Thank the witnesses for being here today, and thank Chairman Denham and Ranking Member Brown for putting together this hearing. It's an important hearing in Mr. Nadler's district. I was just talking to him about the size of his district. My district is about 180 miles across and about 70 or 80 miles deep. His district is a half a mile wide and 7 miles long. We were discussing one day about where he was from. We were talking about his district. I said I come from a town of 2,000. He said I can shake 2,000 hands in one apartment building in a morning. So, you tell you how different this country is. It's really amazing. But it was great coming up here yesterday. Chairman Denham put together a rolling roundtable. So as we rolled up the Northeast Corridor, members from the different states, DOTs were getting on board, talking about their projects, their needs. So it was really a day full of gathering a lot of good information. And I always, when we're doing a Northeast Corridor hearing, I have to have full disclosure. I'm from Pennsylvania, and everybody says, well, he's for the Northeast Corridor because he's from Pennsylvania. I don't live on the Northeast Corridor. My district's not on the Northeast Corridor. I'm Western Pennsylvania, so I'm the other part of the state. But I believe that the Northeast Corridor is extremely important. As Chairman Denham said, talked about the density of population here. When you look at the density of population, 18% of the nation's population on 3% of our land mass, this is the perfect place to look at investing and making sure the passenger rail is viable. Again, you've got 4 of the 10 most populous metro regions in the nation on the Northeast Corridor. And when we look at the United States of America, it took us 65 years to go from 200 million people to 300 million people. In 2005, we crossed that 300 million person threshold, and they projected in 2005 that it would take 32 years to go from 300 million to 400 million. We're 7 years into it. Not everybody's moving from the Northeast Corridor to Ms. Brown's state or Arizona. The density continues to grow and expand, and we need to make sure that the Northeast Corridor, which is our most productive region in the country because of the population and the economic activity that goes on here, we've got to make sure we can move people around. So making sure the Northeast Corridor we pay attention to it, make sure it's reliable, it's efficient. That's what we need to do. And again, when you talk about what this administration has proposed, we recognize we don't have unlimited funds. So we need to make sure we focus on what makes sense and prioritize that investment in the infrastructure. And again, I believe that the Northeast Corridor is one we have to pay attention to. And it's not high-speed rail, but higher-speed rails, and that we can make those investments here in the Northeast Corridor. Again, high-speed rail is great in theory, but with the limited resources we have, as Mr. Denham pointed out, we need to make sure we're focusing those dollars in places where we can have a significant impact, and not think of pie-in-the-sky type investments that really aren't going to give us the kind of benefits that we need. Responsible governing involves choices, and while this administration and its budget wants to fund everything, we really need to, again, focus like a laser on those things that are smart investments. And all I have to do is look to Pennsylvania, from Harrisburg to Philadelphia, the investment that Amtrak and the state of Pennsylvania made in the Keystoner about 5 years ago. Since that time, they've reduced the travel time from Harrisburg to Philadelphia by about 20 minutes, and ridership, the last I checked, which was months ago, was up 60%. It's probably higher than that now. And in fact, I tell people often I should be the poster child for passenger rail, because when my father chaired this committee, and even before, when he was trying to reform Amtrak, I used to say to him as a 20-year-old that didn't know a whole lot, thought I knew a lot, and I'd never get out of my car and get a rail. I needed that freedom to leave, come and go as I please. But now today, I don't come to Philadelphia or New York. I get on the train. I don't drive, whether it's from Harrisburg or Washington, D.C., because it just makes so much sense. You can be so much more productive. So, again, focusing on the Northeast Corridor, getting the investment from the private sector. I think we have to look at the ways to do that, to incentivize them to get into the game here in the Northeast Corridor. And I look forward to working with all of you, trying to figure this out as we go. And again, thank you to Chairman Denham and Ranking Member Brown for holding this hearing. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call on Mr. Nadler for any opening comments he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you and Ranking Member Brown for holding this hearing today on the importance of the Northeast Corridor. I'd like to welcome everybody to my district, although that's been commented on already, and thank everyone for taking such an interest in passenger rail, which is so vital to New York and to other cities along the East Coast. I ride Amtrak every week from New York to Washington and back again. Rail is the most reliable form of transportation, and it should be an option for all travelers within a 500-mile radius of any major city. But the 11.4 million people who ride the Northeast Corridor each year, and the residents and businesses of the region, do not need convincing. The importance of the Northeast Corridor goes without saying. The real question is, how best can we improve the Northeast Corridor and institute true high-speed rail service? We all know that there's at least a $52 billion backlog just to reach a state of good repair and accommodate future growth. The system is old. Much of it was constructed in the 19th or early 20th centuries. Bridges, tunnels, tracks, and signals all need to be upgraded just to keep up with demand on the current system. And the main reason for this backlog is chronic underfunding by the federal government. We place requirements on Amtrak, and then we provide the bare minimum possible for the railroad to function. In the FY12 Transportation Appropriations Bill, DOT received $71 billion, but of that, Amtrak only received $1.4 billion. That's about 2% of federal transportation appropriations for Amtrak nationally, never mind the Northeast Corridor. And then we hold hearings to ponder how we are going to develop the Northeast Corridor. Well, one answer is to invest orders of magnitude more than we currently do in passenger and high-speed rail. Every major transportation system has been created with federally funded capital investments. Every mode of transportation, highways, transit, and aviation, relies on some form of public subsidy. Rail is no different. If we want to develop true high-speed rail in this country, it's going to take a much greater public effort. Unfortunately, the current budget situation in Washington makes it highly unlikely that we will be able to increase funding for critical transportation programs in the near future. We should, but I doubt we will. I hope the situation changes, and I will continue to working to undo the sequester and to increase investment in jobs and economic development. Everyone here who cares about high-speed rail should do the same. In the meantime, a constrained federal budget is going to give people even more of an incentive to turn to the private sector, and that's fine to a point. I think everyone here supports involving the private sector to some extent. Amtrak partners with the private sector now and is exploring opportunities to do so more in the future. But what we shouldn't do is use private financing as an excuse to eliminate or reduce federal investment in passenger rail. In fact, only with a strong federal role will we be able to properly leverage private sector funds. And whatever we do, we must maintain proper federal oversight and control, preserve good-paying jobs, and protect the public interest. The good news is that despite the strain on the federal budget, a lot is actually happening on the corridor. The NEC Advisory Commission is developing its vision for the Northeast Corridor. This includes not just coordination among the states and identifying critical needs for future growth, but also advancing a long-term regional investment strategy. FRA is currently conducting an EIS for corridor-wide development and a service development plan which should be completed in 2015. I hope that we will build upon these efforts when we reauthorize PRIA, the Passenger Rail Investment and Improvement Act, hopefully later this year. Amtrak provides an essential and valuable service. Amtrak and the development of high-speed rail is a critical part of any rational transportation policy. I look forward to hearing from the witnesses and to working with my colleagues to build a competitive and visionary passenger rail system. Thank you. I yield back.
Again, I'd like to welcome our witnesses here today. Let me just go over some quick ground rules. We've got a 5-minute timer up here. We're going to go through a couple of rounds of questioning, but just like a stoplight, green light, keep going. Yellow light, it's time to start hitting the brakes, and red light, your time is up. So, our panel this morning includes John Fry, President of Drexel University, Robert Yaro, President of the Regional Plan Association, the Honorable Joan McDonald, Commissioner of New York State Department of Transportation, and the Honorable Joe Boardman, President and CEO of Amtrak. I ask unanimous consent that our witnesses' full statements be included in the record without objection, so ordered. Since your written testimony has been made part of the record, the subcommittee would request that you limit your oral testimony to 5 minutes. And Mr. Fry, you're first this morning.
Thank you, Representative Denham. Good morning. I'm John Fry, the president of Drexel University, which is located in Philadelphia's, next to Philadelphia's 30th Street Station on the Northeast Corridor in University City. When I was the executive vice president at the University of Pennsylvania, which is right next door to 30th Street Station as well, I founded the University City District, which promotes economic development throughout West Philadelphia. In between, I was president of Franklin and Marshall College in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where I led the Northwest Gateway Project, a brownfield transformation that relocated a Norfolk Southern rail yard in order to connect the Amtrak station in Lancaster to an approximately 60-acre educational and medical district. So I have a deep interest in how urban economic development and transportation intersect. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on the importance of the Northeast Corridor. America's 3 busiest train stations and 7 of the top 10 are on the corridor. 17% of the American population and 20% of the GDP come from the Northeast, with 15 million new residents expected in the next decades. So the Northeast Corridor is the epicenter of American rail travel. And today we are witnessing the incredible redevelopment of the urban cores that it connects. The millennial generation shows a strong preference to work and live in urban environments. Aging baby boomers are relocating to cities for convenience, culture, and overall social environment. These trends are creating new demand for commercial and residential real estate development. Some employers are relocating to access young talent and retain senior personnel, and retail and service firms are ramping up significant urban offerings. At the same time, highway and air travel in the Northeast are stretching beyond capacity. Fortunately, the Northeast Corridor rail service is a largely untapped asset that can be leveraged to take advantage of these trends. With reasonable investment, the corridor can produce considerable returns, not just improved transportation, but the development and long-term growth in its anchor cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Washington. There are great new ideas gathering around the urban stations at the core of the system. Each neighborhood has unique characteristics that can inform the best fit development for the regional economy. Here in New York at Hudson Yards, it's a mixed-use project on the river, an entirely new neighborhood built over a rail yard. In Philadelphia, we're capitalizing on our educational, medical, and research concentrations to develop a new high-tech, transit-oriented neighborhood around 30th Street Station, and similar opportunities exist throughout the Northeast Corridor. Amtrak, to its credit, is studying how their stations can complement these urban neighborhoods. Amtrak's flagship study is the Washington Union Station Master Plan for Washington, and others are happening in Baltimore, Boston, here in New York, and in Philadelphia, where Drexel is proud to be Amtrak's lead partner. Significant value can be created by developing air rights and adjacent land and improving station experiences, and that in turn will drive urban development and lead to reinvestment in Northeast Corridor operations. But the gains are hard to realize given the limited resources of rail operators and government, and the solution is public-private partnerships either with corporate partners or with anchor institutions, particularly research universities and healthcare systems. And that's the model for Drexel's partnership with Amtrak and other Philadelphia stakeholders. Between our campus and 30th Street Station sits about 12 acres of very underutilized land with the potential to yield 6.4 million square feet of development next to the station. Even when commercial interest lagged, it was clear that these were incredibly important parcels, so our university has assembled these parcels at considerable cost to Drexel. Now we've undertaken a mixed-use development called the Innovation Neighborhood, built on several principles. The first principle is to co-locate our vibrant translational research enterprise with corporate partners who can help us commercialize our research and work with us to transform the 30th Street Station area. Translational research thrives when commercial entities are deeply involved, with an eye to licensing and eventually starting up new ventures. So we're in discussions with a number of companies, and I don't think it's far-fetched to envision a high-tech business environment like Cambridge or Research Triangle Park, with all the new jobs and economic growth that implies locating next to 30th Street Station. Our second principle is to use the Northeast Corridor as a competitive advantage for our university. The impact for Philadelphia when visitors disembark into a brand new neighborhood dedicated to learning, innovation, and entrepreneurship is just an incredible vision. But as exciting as an opportunity as the Innovation Neighborhood is, the true transformational opportunity around 30th Street Station is the development of the air rights over the 100-acre Penn coach yards owned by Amtrak and SEPTA. It's Philadelphia's own Hudson Yards, and it's a key dimension of the master planning process led by Amtrak and Drexel. It's a project measured in decades rather than years, but it's the right time to start this work and explore similar ideas along the Northeast Corridor, and that's what we're doing now as we speak. So let's not fail to utilize these incredible assets, and let's be seen as the generation that invested in and leveraged the rail system to its full potential. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Frye. Mr. Yaro.
Thank you for the opportunity. Okay. Thank you very much for the opportunity to testify this morning. I'm Bob Yaro. I'm president of Regional Plan Association, which is a not-for-profit research group here in New York that for a century has done strategic... Oh, sure. Let's see how we do. Yeah, there we go. I'm Bob Yaro. I'm president of Regional Plan Association. For nearly a century, RPA has done strategic planning for the New York metropolitan region, infrastructure, environment, business development, and so forth. Several years ago, we began to look at the Northeast Corridor as one of the keys to New York's mobility and economic future. And again, through my work at the University of Pennsylvania, I've led several research teams that have looked at the opportunities to develop and redevelop the corridor. Today, we've submitted testimony to you that outlines a proposed program that we're calling NEC Now, which would be a priority investment program. Many of the rogues gallery of failing bridges or antique bridges and tunnels that you saw yesterday, or all of them, I guess, are on your list. You know, we've got this problem of century-old infrastructure, which is being held together by Amtrak with Band-Aids and baling wire. At this point, we learned with Sandy just how vulnerable it is to catastrophic damage with the flooding that we had in the Hudson River tunnels, which virtually shut down the mobility system of the Northeast for a week. This is a really expensive hobby. We have a $1.5 trillion economy here in New York. The Northeast has a nearly $3 trillion economy. It's driven by accessibility. That's one of the reasons why people locate here and stay here. It's why talented people come here. It's why the Northeast, has for 230 or 40 years been the engine of the national economy and continues to be. There's close to a quarter of the national economy is here in the Northeast. We virtually shut it down with Sandy and the loss of the Amtrak service and the intercity service. And by the way, it's not just Amtrak's service that we depend on. It's about 11 million passengers a year. It's a total of 260 million passengers a year that use the commuter rail services in the Northeast. This is really the lifeblood of our economy. These tend to be the highly skilled people that drive the innovation economy of the Northeast: financial services, business services, science, technology, and so forth. And the reason, as President Frye mentioned, that we can think about having innovation districts around stations is that this mobility system, the Northeast Corridor, is critical to both the present and the future future economy of the Northeast. So we believe that the very first thing, of course, that has to happen, and this is I was going to open, and you'll see in the testimony that I opened with this a bit of history. 51 years ago this year, two New England politicians proposed long-range visions for the United States, and one of them, of course, was President Kennedy's call for reaching the moon within a decade. The other was Senator Claiborne Pell's proposal for a high-speed rail corridor in the Northeast between Boston and Washington, which would have been the world's first. Of course, we did get to the moon. We didn't quite get to Boston with the Northeast Corridor improvements. So elected officials have been kicking this one down the road for 2 generations, and we believe that it really is time to begin work, not just in attaining a state of good repair, but actually creating improvements, expansion and capacity, reliability, travel time savings, and so forth. So in the testimony that we've submitted, you'll see that we've outlined what we call a Northeast Corridor Now program, and this is not to in any way undercut the important work that the Federal Railroad Administration is doing with its NEC Future program, the long-range master plan for the corridor, which is urgently needed. But we've got a set of bridges and tunnels and interlockings and so forth that are prone to failure. You know, it's kind of like I've had back trouble, and at times people ask me how I'm doing, and I said, well, I feel like a 90-year-old man. I'm feeling really good today, but you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. And many of these facilities really fall into that category. I think you'll hear from President Boardman that Amtrak, very often on the Susquehanna Bridge or some of the Connecticut movable bridges, very often we'll have to have people out there with crowbars to get these things closed, once they've been opened. And, we've been we really ought to secure some of these things for the Smithsonian Institution when we're done building their replacements, because they really are industrial archaeology at this point. So the $39 billion program that we're recommending would be funded by, under this proposal, $10 billion in grants, $30 billion in RIF loans that would be repaid by the states and by Amtrak over an extended period of time. And we believe that there are real opportunities for private investment as well. And we believe that Northeast Corridor Division of Amtrak is well positioned to do that. Could use some additional authority to enter into P3s and design build projects to deliver this thing within a 10 or 15 year period. Thank you very much.
Ms. McDonald.
Good morning and welcome to Moynihan Station. I'm Joan McDonald, Commissioner of the New York State Department of Transportation. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to discuss with you today the efforts of Governor Cuomo and New York State DOT as they relate to mutual cooperation, planning, and investment. We're all aware that realizing a bolder vision for the future requires unprecedented collaboration among states. New York State DOT is working through the Northeast Corridor Commission on comprehensive corridor planning. This is a daunting task for a corridor that spans 8 states in the District of Columbia, supports 9 passenger rail operations, including 4 of the 5 largest commuter rail services in North America, serves 4 freight railroads, and has 4 separate infrastructure owners. We've risen to this challenge and made the most of the resources available and the expertise of the professionals who are dedicated to realizing our mission. Our goals are varied, but they are all crucial components of what we are ultimately striving for: economic growth, connectivity, improved service reliability, and improved travel time. While more resources are always needed to continue the good work we've already begun, the Northeast Corridor has benefited from the $1.3 billion in capital funds appropriated to Amtrak in the ARA Act and another approximately $1 billion in high-speed rail program grants from the Federal Railroad Administration. On top of that, Northeast states have received almost $700 million in grants for connecting rail corridors, as Congressman Shuster said, in Pennsylvania, as we have experienced here in New York between Albany and New York City. In New York, under the leadership of Governor Andrew Cuomo, construction is underway on a new grade-separated flyover at Harold Interlocking, where Amtrak, New Jersey Transit, and Long Island Railroad trains 783 per day, converge north of Penn Station at the busiest junction in North America. The $368 million removal of this bottleneck is funded in part with a recently awarded $295 million grant from FRA, but here in New York, we believe locals must also participate, so the MTA contributed a healthy $73 million in state funds towards that project. In addition, with the support of $83 million in federal tighter grant funds and $30 million in FRA funding, New York, in partnership with Amtrak and private developers right here at Moynihan Station, have begun construction on $297 million of improvements for passenger access under what is planned to be a new station on the site of the former Farley Post Office building where we're sitting, adjacent to the existing Penn Station. As we look further ahead, much more is on the horizon. The Gateway project to expand capacity across the Hudson River and within Penn Station is in the preliminary design, as is Phase 2 of the Moynihan Station project to construct the new train hall in this building. It's clear that New York works. And while we take pride in the accomplishments of my home state, my work as the former chair of the Northeast Corridor Commission for the past 2 years has been focused on the much bigger picture that the vast needs of the corridor entail, as well as the necessary and fulfilling task of strengthening existing partnerships and building new ones. I'm proud of the way all of the states in D.C. committed to and endorsed each other's projects while never losing sight of our individual state core mission and goals. Connectivity is a key element of what we are working to improve in transportation and economic development, and connectivity is what we have achieved in this collaborative relationship. We know the Northeast Corridor must balance critical investment needs just to maintain the safety and reliability of current services with the concurrent need to address consistently growing passenger service demands. The fact that commuter service and Amtrak services interconnect at common facilities and on common trackages creates a situation where delays to any one service will quickly cascade and adversely affect the on-time performance of the other rail services. Without significant and sustained levels of infrastructure investment, rail operations on the corridor will suffer, as will the economic benefits of the corridor. The reality is that deferred maintenance of key components in the corridor is no longer an option. Infrastructure inherited from past generations can no longer provide the mobility needed to support continued robust economic growth. New investment in state of good repair is essential. We often think what might happen if we lost this invaluable resource, and Hurricane Sandy brought that home. The PREA Act, which created this commission, is about improvements, and this work is well underway, but PREA is also about investing. The Northeast Corridor is a national resource, and we look forward to working with you on the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. McDonald. Mr. Boardman.
Chairman Denham, Ranking Member Brown, Chairman Shuster, and Member Nadler, thanks for the invitation to testify this morning. Given that we've had an opportunity to see the Northeast Corridor firsthand, I think it would probably be more useful if I discuss this asset in the context of reauthorization and funding concerns rather than reviewing the plans and programs we discussed on our trip up to New York. As you probably know, Amtrak took the Northeast Corridor over from the privately owned Penn Central Railroad in 1976. Penn Central was then in bankruptcy, and the transfer of Northeast Corridor to Amtrak was part of a much larger federal plan involving Conrail. The Northeast Corridor passed to Amtrak, which implemented several significant repair and improvement programs in partnership with the FRA, which transformed a dilapidated mid-century rail operation into the high-speed and high-capacity rail route we have today. We've done a lot with that business, but today we face a lot of challenges. We've mapped out an investment plan to build capacity on the existing Northeast Corridor, but the limits of the existing infrastructure are the results of the limited investments that have been made available. We share the route with 8 commuter operations in several of the most important segments, such as the New York tunnels, are at capacity. Demand for intercity and commuter passenger rail is growing. The federal government must act now with this reauthorization opportunity to take the lead in funding a major program that will build out the rail infrastructure we're going to need in the next coming century. These are questions any reauthorization must deal with, but there's a more pressing and immediate question, and that is the decapitalization of Amtrak's assets. Decapitalization occurs when the total annual capital allocation is insufficient to meet both the ongoing normalized replacement and the backlog capital requirements. And that means today we're eating our assets alive. That leads to rapidly increasing degradation of ride quality, reliability, and ability to support major projects like those discussed on our trip here and those being discussed this morning. On the way up, Chairman, I said to you that when Amtrak installed concrete ties, they were expected to last 40 to 50 years. The average life was only 10 to 15 years. This premature failure has taken funding for replacement that would have gone to other work like interlocking replacement and ballast maintenance and cleaning, or the removal and replacement of the subsoil and ballast to stop the mud pumping and the rough ride that may cause us to begin to slow down our speeds. Decapitalization is increasing the number of incidents on electric traction and communication and signal systems that reduce reliability. These issues must be addressed and thought through for any reauthorization. Amtrak completed a comprehensive state of good repair plan in 2005, vetted it with appropriate parties including Congress, the administration, the oversight agencies. Then Amtrak updated it every 2 years, and 2011 is the most recent update. The present backlog is $6 billion. I need $386 million every year for normalized maintenance, and I need $396 million every year for the backlog work, and I need it for the next 15 years. I need $782 million every year for the next 15 years, and that will not address capacity improvements or trip time reductions or other new initiatives, but it will allow Amtrak to run a safe railroad at maximum allowed track speed, maintain an excellent on-time performance, and meet the basic needs of those who want to develop real estate and fill their development with people who they expect to come by train. Amtrak, New Jersey Transit, Long Island Railroad, Metro North, SEPTA, MARC, MBTA, Shoreline East, and VRE. The reduced level of investment has resulted in a cumulative degradation of its components, nearing the loss of asset functionality and decreased reliability of the system that threatens the successful continuity of Amtrak's passenger operation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Boardman, and thank you to all of our witnesses. Let me just say that this committee is very focused on getting the passenger reauthorization bill done this year. It does expire in the fall, and we certainly want to work with all of you as well as the stakeholders up and down the Northeast Corridor and across the nation. And you all have been very willing partners. It makes the job a lot easier to see the Northeast Corridor come together, prioritize, work together. We have had meetings in D.C. now. We've had our rolling roundtable now here, and we'll continue to travel across the nation looking at all rail projects and both long, short-haul, state-supported routes. We'll be in Chicago next week and Springfield, taking a look at the projects that are going there. So we're very committed to this, and we certainly appreciate your partnership. Let me start with the questioning this morning. First, Mr. Fry, one of the things that we continue to talk about, both in the challenges with California and its high-speed rail and the lack of private investor there to be able to complete that plan, we're looking at private investment, public-private partnerships, and wanted to start the questioning with you. Can you explain how you're finding your innovation neighborhood project? Just explain a little more in detail how that is working.
Okay, thank you. So to date, Drexel has spent approximately $30 million to assemble the 12.5 acres that I mentioned earlier, which would yield the 6.5 million feet. So that's been our primary investment today. And in working with President Boardman, we've created a joint venture between Amtrak and Drexel to now study the feasibility of developing the air rights over the 100-acre Penn coach yards, which are owned and utilized by Amtrak and SEPTA. That study will be between $2 and $3 million, and the university will fund that study because we believe, since we've initiated this, and Amtrak obviously has its resource constraints, that the private sector, in this case Drexel, will step in and fund that study.
$2 million for the study?
Between 2 and 3. Probably, let's say, $3 million.
And $32 million was what Drexel's?
$30 million for the assemblage of the property around 30th Street Station, and we spent that over the last decade. So we're already really invested in just sort of assembling the ground and beginning to think about the development of the ground. In the meantime, what we're doing is now beginning to construct university buildings in that area, and so we're just about to open in September a $90 million business school located at 32nd and Market, which is in this innovation neighborhood, and we are now also getting prepared to put out a series of RFPs to begin to take a look at other parcels within that 12.5 acres to see if they can be developed for commercial, residential, and retail purposes, and we'll do that all with private sector dollars. And so between the university and private sector developer partners, we intend to begin the orderly development of the 12.5 acres that we control as we're studying the air rights development over the Amtrak and SEPTA properties. We think all of that will come together into a probably decades-long development, which again I think would be largely funded by the private sector. Of course, the key to taking this and bringing it to the next level is the high-speed rail, which would bring us under 40 minutes to New York and about an hour to Washington. I think if that occurs over time, that takes what we're doing, which is a pretty significant thing, and drives it to the next level in terms of its potential.
And did you initially do an analysis to determine what spending levels you would need, what resources would be available to improvements, and
that's what this study this $3 million study we're engaging in will basically be a technical study to take a look at the air rights development, to understand what is the feasibility of that, first of all, technically, because the big issue, of course, is to not impact in any negative way rail travel through 30th Street Station. That's sort of job one. And then job two is to figure out, if it's technically feasible, what is the financial investment, and how would that be made, and how would that be financed over time.
Thank you. And since we're at the ground level of development, without any additional funding, how can federal policymakers encourage more developments like your project?
As many tax incentive programs for rail development around major train stations like 30th Street Station, the incentive programs really work well. We have something called the Keystone Opportunity Zone in Philadelphia, which has really been a pretty brilliant incentive for development in Philadelphia. It's sort of a 10-year tax abatement. 10 of our sites within the 12.5 acres have this Keystone Opportunity Zone designation. If there could be other federal programs that would help stimulate development around stations like 30th Street, that would be enormously helpful. I would say that's the first thing, and of course, funding for high-speed rail would be the other thing.
Thank you. Ms. Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I guess I'm really smiling because for once, I think we're all on the same page. We understand, and Mr. Chairman, we have you on tape saying that we want more speed, and the question is, how are we going to get there? And there's a couple of things a couple of questions. The RIF loan, we all support it. I don't care whether it was the Bush administration or the present administration. Is some reason why we can't get that program to work. And I would like to know what are the things that we could do to get the improvements in that program, so we can get. We have bonding capacity for how much money? 30 billion, and you say you want it all, but just tell me, how can we improve that program? And also, you mentioned is 53 miles, I think it's in the New York area, that the train has to go a certain, can go a certain, about 15, what's the mileage that they can go, and what is the problem?
It's the territory north of New York to New Haven, Connecticut.
Yeah, and so that is one of the reasons why we can't speed it up. So can you discuss those two things? Mm-hmm.
I can talk about it a little bit, Congresswoman. We have a commuter operation that owns the piece of the property between, after you go into New York and on to Connecticut, that only has a need of a speed of about 70 miles an hour. It's an area that we believe we could do 110 miles an hour and reduce the amount of time traveled, because it's a 50, 60 mile piece of railroad, and it's something that means that all of that would need to be upgraded, which would take investment, either transit investment or Amtrak or.
What's the cost on that, Mr.?
I don't have it here. I think we have an estimate that could be identified. I don't think that's in the critical infrastructure, is it, Joan? No. That didn't get put in there.
Well, that is something that we need to know. How could we?
Yeah, we can do that, and we can follow up with a response on that.
But the RIF loan, because that has been a sticking point, and I think all of the members support improving the program, because that is one way that we could fund the system.
Well, I can comment on that, and I think what we need to do is to modify the program so that it works more like the TIFIA program, which does work on bridges and highways well. I think one of the issues is the extreme requirement for collateral up front. So Amtrak, for example, can't use its budget as collateral towards RIF loans. What we would suggest is that, in fact, any federal grants that are made to Amtrak or to other to the states along the corridor, that they be able to use their federal funds as collateral towards the RIF loans. I mean, they have pretty good credit, these states, and in fact, it's a publicly owned asset. This is not, and I think part of the problem is that the RIF loan program was written with private freight railroads in mind. Here we are talking about a publicly owned asset. It's a federally owned asset for the most part. States own pieces of it and so forth. Not going away. It's a public responsibility, and so I think it's probably safe to assume that this is a safe credit risk if, in fact, we make loans and made those modifications. So that's really essential, and that would be something that we would hope would be included in the new PREA legislation.
Mr. Boardman?
One of the important parts, and Bob's right in many ways, but the difference with TIFIA and with highway is you have contract authority, and year after year you receive funding on the highway side, whereas with Amtrak it's year to year. So the way OMB or the risk folks would really look at this is you may not have an appropriation the following year, which means there's no money there to pay back the loan. That's the reason that occurred that way.
Mr. Fry, having gone to Europe, everywhere there's a high-speed station, there's development around those stations, and even, let's say, Crystal City, where I lived for 10 years, every place that you have a development like that, all kinds of opportunities develop, whether it's daycare, hair salons, or drugstores, or coffee shops. So that is the key to get those developments around those stations.
I couldn't agree more, and I think that in addition to the things that you outlined, the idea in University City, home to University of Pennsylvania, Drexel University, Children's Hospital Philadelphia, Hospital University of Pennsylvania, there's over $1 billion of sponsored research, being conducted within, a half a dozen blocks of each other. And so the idea of taking this area and devoting it to the purposes of innovation and entrepreneurship and new business formation, in addition to building strong neighborhoods next to the station, is a really exciting type of thing.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Shuster.
Thank you. Ms. McDonald, I know you're the former chairwoman of the Northeast Corridor, and you're the former chair of the Northeast Corridor. And if you would, can you tell us some of the concerns states have when they're asked to invest their money in Amtrak?
Sure. We've been in existence for 2 years, created as a result of the PREA legislation. And I think, as I mentioned in my testimony, one of the key areas is, states are very, proud of their home states. And when the funding became available from Florida and other states and got reallocated, we made the decision to endorse each other's projects. And that was a huge first step, because it really demonstrated to each of us that we were not only committed to our home state but to the corridor. Some of the frustrations with any construction project is how quickly they get off the ground. And there have been, and we've had this conversation with FRA, getting some of the funds out the door. The most difficult part of these construction projects is doing the work in active railroads. And it's not just the active Amtrak intercity passenger, but for almost every state, the commuter rail, and making sure that the work gets done in very tight windows. You know, like Stephen Gardner mentioned yesterday, the tunnel, the work that gets done on the weekends, which is the busiest, one of the busiest ridership times. So there are frustrations, as with any capital construction project. Work takes too long. In New York, we just adopted, under Governor Cuomo's leadership, design-build legislation, which really gets the projects out the door much more quickly. So we want to make sure that that both FRA and Amtrak are using all of the tools at their disposal also.
Well, I'm a big fan of design-build. I mean, we ought to be pushing that everywhere we can.
It's helped tremendously, tremendously.
And can you provide us information on the savings that you believe you've reaped, or the time savings, the money, the dollar savings? Because that's something that we need to have evidence to.
I'd be happy to do that. It's primarily with our road and bridge projects, but we can show where it's worked and how it's providing great benefits.
Mr. Yaro, in PREA, we passed the legislation that says the states are going forward are going to pay their fair share. I'm not sure that fair share is the right. I don't know if they're paying enough, and I just wanted your view on the benefits that these commuter rails and communities receive from Amtrak. Do you believe it's the right thing to do, is these communities to share in the maintenance of
Yeah, and as you know, the PREA legislation called for the commission to develop a cost allocation formula, essentially, and that analysis is being done. The negotiations are underway between the states. The challenge is that as Joe Boardman said, we have a depreciating asset here. We have an asset that's deteriorating. The backlog, has of deferred maintenance, has and normal replacement investments has gotten bigger, not smaller. And so basically what we're asking the states to do is to belly up to help fund a depreciating asset. So I describe it, it's kind of like going over here to Macy's and saying, we've got a great sale here, we're going to ask you to pay more for less. It's really a hard sale. And I think what we need to do is to change that so that, in fact, there is an upfront, commitment by the federal government to finally restoring this corridor to a state of good repair. It's now, added up, what is it, Joe? It's close to 40 years now that we've, since the federal government took this thing over, and we just keep kicking this down the road. So, and it's very interesting. I think if you guys haven't done it, take a look at the experience in the United Kingdom, where they privatized the rail system without investing in it up front. They had several disastrous train wrecks and so forth. They renationalized it, then dropped close to $100 billion into bringing the whole system back to a state of good repair. And then they were able to bring in private development, P3s and so forth, to operate trains. They're now talking about privatizing it again. But this time they got a real opportunity to do it because it's a functioning asset.
Well, and also what we've learned in Europe is by 2014, the EU's passed a law that on any rail, passenger rail, there's going to be competition.
Right.
So that's something else we can look at over there. And to my good friend from Florida, I do believe in higher speed. I'm not so sure in my lifetime if we're going to see high speed, but I think what's more important, and I think the example in England that I learned is it's not always about speed, it's about reliability and it's about frequency.
And capacity, right?
Exactly. And I Virgin Rail told the story of they were going to, I forget what line it was, going into London.
Yeah.
It was an hour and 15 minutes, and they, as any good company would do, they went and polled their customers and said, we're going to take it from an hour and 15 down to 55 or 50 minutes.
Yeah.
And it was overwhelmingly rejected. So they did focus groups and said, why don't you want to get there quicker? And they said, an hour and 15 minutes is perfect timing for me to get on the train, get a cup of coffee, boot up my computer, do some work, and when I get to work, I've been productive. But 50 minutes, they said, by the time you get your coffee, boot up your computer, we're there. So it's not always about speed.
But when you go back to the United Kingdom, they have also, they're now investing It's about $60 billion in a high-speed service between London and Manchester, eventually to be extended to Scotland. And they're doing it to create the kind of economic transformations that John Fry was talking about. They're to create real synergies between the economies of the cities in the Northeast. That we do need to strive for that. And we can move towards higher speed service, and that's really what the Acela service is. And then, and that's proven that the people will pay a premium. But
I've violated my own rule. I've gone over the 5-minute rule. The chairman is staring me down, so I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Nadler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner McDonald, some have suggested mandating competition on the Northeast Corridor. We were just talking about that. The corridor is jam-packed. We know all the statistics. I think we should be focusing on addressing the backlog on the corridor and needed infrastructure improvements. What are your views on that?
I agree with you. I think investments in the corridor are key, and as Bob just pointed out, that's what's going to make a successful railroad. And I was thinking, as he was discussing with Chairman Shuster, what Metro North and Long Island Railroad have done over a 30-year period is they've invested $22 billion, almost all of it in state of good repair, and one of the reasons they've been able to do it is because they have known 5-year capital plans so they can make those state of good repair investments. And I think the investments has to be the top priority.
Thank you, Mr. Boardman. You comment on the same thing?
I'd be happy with 5 years of capital investment that we could count on, absolutely.
You don't have 5 years now.
No, we do not. We have plans, but we have
Assurances.
no assurances.
Thank you. Mr. Boardman, some in Congress have proposed separating Amtrak's operations and maintenance into two separate businesses. Do you have any concerns with that?
Yes. I think it's I think you have to have a system that operates for the safety of the public and for efficiency together, not separate.
Thank you. And also, do you believe the private sector would invest in the Northeast Corridor in its current state? And if not, what would it take to attract private investment?
Well, actually, and I think John Fry talked about it, they're already investing in the Northeast Corridor from the standpoint of the real estate development.
I don't mean that. I mean, it's obvious to me that where you have assets, especially air rights or territory around rail hubs, that you should use those assets, and you should have private sector partnerships, sell them, whatever, and develop exactly as Mr. Fry was talking about, and realize income for the railroads too. But I mean, invest in the railroad itself.
I think that Perry Offit answered that in a couple previous, and he's an investor here in New York, is that there would have to be some availability payments if the private sector was going to invest in anything. There would have to be a guarantee that the federal government would continue to provide subsidy or investment, however you would look at it. If there wasn't enough revenue, then there would be availability payments from the government, and that's how it's worked almost everywhere.
No Congress can bind its successor, as you know, so would a multi-year authorization be sufficient to provide such guarantees?
I would have to ask the private sector to deal with that, but there are a lot of innovative ways today that the federal government and others have looked at doing something like that. Doesn't mean that sitting here as the president of Amtrak that I'm supportive of it. The fact is that there are a lot of creative ways today to do something different, but you do have to have contract authority to do it.
And some have recommended a new governance structure for the corridor. Do you have any views on that?
We have one. We already have one.
And it's sufficient one. Okay, and finally, Congress has failed to provide the high-speed intercity passenger rail program with any federal funding for the last two fiscal years. With future funding still uncertain, can you explain why funding is so important, and what is at risk in the Northeast Corridor if we fail to make adequate investments?
Well, I think that a lot of people said and talked about that all the way around that this morning. I think that the financial community of this nation, New York, where we're sitting today, is at real risk without the investments that are going to be necessary to become competitive globally, and that includes faster railroads in the Northeast.
So we can't depend on P3s or private sector investment for that. We've got to have substantial federal investment.
Absolutely. There are no really fast railroads today that have avoided having government take a lead role.
Thank you. Finally, Mr. Yaro, you stated that the RPA recommends that the next federal rail bill authorize funding to completely eliminate the $9 billion backlog of major state of good repair problems and make certain improvements and substantial additional funding to address major infrastructure needs in the corridor.
Yes.
Do you believe this should be financed by the federal government? And at what point would there be the greatest potential for private investment?
Well, I think, everywhere in the world, the government investments have had to come first, and to essentially prime the pump. I think once that happens, that in fact, that there could be opportunities certainly for design build, and that provides real efficiency, shares some risk, and so
But
forth.
not until the federal investment.
But I think there has to be a public. Again, we've got this thoroughly depreciated asset. It's got to be a viable asset, and I think once that happens, that yes, indeed, there would be opportunities for public-private partnerships. One key thing to keep in mind is that when private investors put money into a project, they generally want to get their money back with interest, and so now it's possible, given we've got 260 million passengers a year on the corridor. The projection is that if we make these investments, it'll go up to 410 million over a 25-year period. So the potential is there for the passengers to help finance this thing, and that might be a way to do public-private partnerships.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Boardman, what's your definition of fix it first with regards to Northeast Corridor?
I think it's getting as close to the state of good repair as we possibly can along the corridor.
And would you prioritize existing infrastructure replacement and improve ahead of your high-speed rail vision?
Yes.
So the $30 billion is fixing it first. We've got to fix the current
Yeah, the
situation.
$6 billion is what I'm really talking about, Chairman, that absolutely needs to be done to the basic infrastructure on the corridor. When we get to 30 or the 52 or whatever you call it in the critical infrastructure, that's more than state of good repair in terms of the basic infrastructure. It includes rebuilding other facilities at a much higher level.
Thank you. And when you prioritize investment, is there a cost-benefit analysis conducted with ridership, economic benefits to local, state, and federal entities?
Well, there's some. I don't know if it's in the detail that people would really be looking for, but we've done several studies that look at cost-benefit based on speed, reliability, on-time performance. All of those exist. Hasn't been broken down, I don't think, to every particular local jurisdiction, but for the corridor itself, yes.
Thank you. And if you could provide that cost-benefit analysis to us, that would...
Sure. I think it's been provided to you, but we'll look and see whether the business plan that was put together for the high speed has been supplied. I think it has, Mike.
Thank you. And I think I've got a little difference of opinion with the chair. I do think that we'll see high-speed rail in my lifetime. The question is, what is it going to look like? And my concern with California is it was passed by voters, a $33 billion project, was supposed to have a private investor that was going to pick up a third of that and buy the rolling stock. And it had a pretty aggressive timeline. Now that timeline is much longer, and they've got a real shortfall in funding by their own numbers, which I think I have some big questions about their own numbers, but by their own numbers, there's a $38 billion shortfall. So they're breaking ground in 2 months, going to spend the first $6 billion. They have a $38 billion shortfall. I would assume that once the project starts, that there will be a push from my friends in Congress to finish that project. With limited funds, if you spend $38 billion in California, I would assume, because the project has started, that has some type of effect on the Northeast Corridor. I mean, we have a big problem with funds today. So do each of you have concerns with California high-speed rail and whether or not we can see just writing yesterday, what needs to be done? My concern with the Northeast Corridor is we can't afford to wait until something breaks or there is a safety issue before we fix it. And would like to have each of you comment on the funding issue from a federal perspective and whether you have concerns with California high-speed rail. Mr. Yaro?
Well, if you're looking for somebody to do a hatchet job on California high-speed rail, I'm not sure I want to do that. I guess what
And I'm not asking you to pick on California high-speed rail. I'm asking about the federal funding.
well, let me put it a different...
Because we have to prioritize.
Right.
There's only so much money, and we're going to be looking at the entire nation, different high-speed rail projects, different long, short-haul routes, as well as the improvements on the Northeast Corridor, and hopefully someday soon, actually high-speed rail on the Northeast Corridor. But we have to figure out how to fund those projects.
Well, as you and I were chatting before the hearing began, these are very different projects. We have the most densely used, heavily used transportation corridor in the United States here in the Northeast. The Central Valley piece of the California project, which is in your district, of course, there is no effective rail system now. There's a very slow Amtrak line that uses an existing freight line and so forth. So it's very different. The challenge in the Northeast is to accommodate the next 20 million people that we think we expect to have here, in 30 years. And in California, it's virtually the same number. It's about a 15 or 20 million increase in the population of the state of California. Both places have enormous problems with the capacity of airspace and the aviation system and the roadway system to accommodate the projected growth in intercity travel demand. That's
Just
what we're dealing
from
with.
a funding issue.
Yeah.
I mean, we're going to deal with the same thing on the highway bill. There's a huge shortage of funds. We've got to fix
Right.
the highways, but we only have about 2 years worth of funding for a 5-year bill.
Yeah.
We're going to deal with the same thing on the rail as well. We want to improve the Northeast Corridor, but if you're trying to come up with a new $38 billion for California high-speed rail, and that's somehow prioritized over the Northeast Corridor, does that concern you?
I think it does. Yes. One thing I'd suggest, and I recommended that we pull down as much of the $30 billion in RIF loans that are available for the Northeast. One way to handle this thing would just say we're going to make loan funds available for high-speed and intercity transportation projects and allow for a competitive process. In the Northeast, I know that the capacity is there to pay back those loans because we've got the ridership now and the projected increases in ridership in the future to support that.
Thank you.
That might be a way of handling it.
Ms. McDonald.
Sure. I want to focus on a couple issues that you raised. First of all, you mentioned the potential of $38 billion in shortfall. And in my 20-plus years in transportation, one of the things that both government, the construction industry, and elected officials all participate in is, like you said, once the shovel's in the ground, nobody's going to stop construction. So how do we deal with cost overruns? And that is an issue that is confronting, like you said, both on the transit side and on the road and bridge side. And what we've adopted at New York State DOT is the preservation first, which speaks to Joe Boardman's point of investing the $6 billion or $9 billion, whichever it was, in state of good repair. You start to get to that steady state, and you have certainty as to what those costs are going to be over a 5-10-year horizon. You then have more discretion to do the capacity building projects, but it requires what I call small p political will, which are all of us as managers to hold people's feet to the fire and use the innovative contracting mechanisms, design build, using guaranteed maximum price, using incentives and disincentives for contractors, and being forthright at the front end what the true cost of the project is. We can't say it's a $1 billion project if if everybody around the table knows it's really a $4 billion project, and we have to make sure that those conversations happen. But it really is, I believe, using the different contracting mechanisms and having strong management in disincentives when costs overrun.
Thank you. Mr. Fry?
I can't really comment on the funding situation, but I can say that it'd be nice to be able to demonstrate to the American people that there's a project out there that actually could get done that would demonstrate in visible ways what high-speed rail can mean. And of course, in a very self-centered way, I would love that project, the first one, to be from Philadelphia to New York. It's a reasonable distance. I think it would prove the concept, to everyone who would take advantage of that right now. And again, that's obviously biased on my part. On the other hand, I think that's a relatively manageable distance. It's two very populated cities, and I think it then lends itself to phasing on other parts of the East Coast.
Thank you. Ms. Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just say that if you get on a train in downtown Paris, you can go from downtown Paris to downtown Brussels, 200 miles, 1 hour and 15 minutes. I mean, that is the world. Our competitors, like China, $350 billion in rail. And we're fighting about, let me just read the staff notes. The Northeast region essentially equates to the United Kingdom. It's worth noting that UK spend billions more than the U.S. invests in the entire nation. In fact, they spend $6.6 billion annually in maintenance and improvement. So, I just feel like we need to get serious about rail, like we are definitely serious about highways in the United States and airports, and think outside of the box. First of all, how can we harden the system so that we can protect the passengers from attack from the outside, whether it's a natural attack or whether it's from someone that's trying to infiltrate the system. I mean, we need to think how we can move the Northeast Corridor, and we all support that. And I support high speed or more speed in the Northeast Corridor. When you think about what can we do, maybe it's a one-stop permitting process. That's, we say design build, but there are other factors that increase to the how long it takes to develop a project. So if you want to respond to that.
Well, I started out by talking about Claiborne Pell's vision for the Northeast as the world's first high-speed rail system. There are now 14 of these systems operating around the world, 12 more being planned. All of our competitors are making these investments, and it's high-speed and it's intercity rail and higher speed services. But the notion is creating balanced transportation systems so that you've got modes that get people where they need to get in the most efficient way possible. That's really what we're talking about here in the Northeast, and I think nationally that's what we need to be thinking about. And you opened up, Chairman Shuster, your comments about the growth in the population of this country. We have an enormous opportunity here to create new capacity in the economy of this country. It's something that the Europeans and the Japanese and the Chinese don't have, where they've got stable or declining populations. We've got an increasing population. There's another committee somewhere that's talking about what we need to do to educate people and do all that sort of thing. What we're talking about here is creating the physical infrastructure that's needed to make this economy in this century what it was in the last century, the most efficient place to move people and goods in the world, so that we can create an economy that we've got a $15 trillion economy. By mid-century, we ought to be looking at a 45 or 50 trillion dollar economy, creating the capacity for that economy to occur. That's how you finance these improvements, and that is what the rest of the world is doing, is making those investments, creating new productive capacity, and then that creates the tax revenues and the private sector activity that you can use to support both public and private investments in these infrastructure systems. But what we've learned all over the world is that public money has to prime the pump. And once you've done that, then it's possible to attract the private investment. It's possible to create the ridership, that you can use then to finance both public and private investments, and repay private loans and public investments.
What would be one of if each one of you could give us a recommendation as to what this committee need to do, what would be your number one priority?
Well, I think you heard it from all of us. Is that first? Let's pay off. Let's invest in, knocking off the backlog in state of good repair improvements in the Northeast Corridor. That's about $6 billion. We've got this project, here in New York and New Jersey. The Gateway Tunnel project under the Hudson. It's the biggest single bottleneck in the corridor. There's another one across the street here at Penn Station that's part of this whole thing. That if we can fix those two things, we can uncork the capacity of the whole Northeast corridor to dramatically improve the reliability, frequency, capacity of the corridor, and so forth. And there are a set of investments that we've outlined that add up to about $39 billion that actually came out of the Corridor Commission. The sort of the list and a very carefully vetted list of priority projects that essentially kind of unleash the potential of this system, again, to underpin the kind of expanded economic activity that we're all talking about here. So, and in my testimony, you'll see the list of projects. It's the same list of projects that the Northeast Corridor Commission has come up with that's in the Amtrak Master Plan and so forth. We all agree on what needs to be done here. It will require an upfront federal investment to make it happen. I think if we do that, we got to incentivize the states to come forward and to provide and to do their share and so forth. I think there is the potential for riders to pay more, particularly the commuter rail passengers, who want reliability. You've all said it: reliability, frequency, as much as travel time savings.
And
Thank you. First of all, I just want to remind my good friend from Florida that in Europe, they're making these investments. They use a cost-benefit analysis, and it's brutal. If it doesn't make sense, they don't do it. And if they're going to do it for Brussels or for Berlin, they're going to make that city put forth a good chunk of the money. And the other thing is in China, my understanding is if you bring a lawsuit in China, you show up with your attorney, they show up with a bulldozer. In essence, you're going to get crushed if you don't get out of the way. So we have very different systems. And again, as I mentioned earlier, passenger rail in Europe, there's going to be at least two competing lines or two competing operations on every line. So we want to learn about what Europe's doing. We got to take up some of those cost-benefit analysis, put competition in. The states own these operations to a great extent, and they're more capitalistic than we are when they're coming, free. They're trying to be more free enterprise driven than we are. So we need to look at that. Mr. Boardman, what is a bigger priority for Amtrak, the Northeast Corridor or the long distance lines, long distance services?
The long-distance services.
Why would they be the priority?
Because you wouldn't have expected that answer, Chairman. I think that, and I say that partly in humor, but I think that where the core of this company came from, and the reason it was created in 1971 was to relieve the freight railroads, which are now freight railroads, from a passenger losing operation. This nation needs to be tied together on the surface of the United States from the coast to coast, border to border. We feed 500,000 riders a year into the Northeast Corridor. The Northeast Corridor is an extremely important asset, and I sat in Joan's seat in the past and understand the necessity here to make sure that this is a high priority. It's a struggle, and let me go back to something, and I didn't answer the question, and I will answer the question of high-speed rail in California, and that is, you folks are in a very difficult position trying to figure out how to balance the funding in the United States for all the things that need to be done, and I appreciate that and understand that, and I appreciate the thoughtfulness in how you're trying to deal with this. And it's not just high-speed rail in California. It's the next generation of air traffic control. It's what you're doing with the water system. Is how do we maintain the interstate highway system, and the battles that occurred, and I was there for some of them, I'm getting old now, of how we actually got some of the interstate highways funded, just like Interstate 88, and how your dad handled Route 15, which was never really identified the way it needed to be to make improvements. But what we found in the end, and as we got to the end of that, is that every one of those were important to the local communities, or at least some segment of the local community, and to the economy where it was actually invested in. And so for that reason, I support high-speed rail in California, and I also support the high-speed to the extent they can get it in Michigan and Illinois and in Texas and even in Florida if it happens.
Well, but the reality of the world today, as you mentioned, we're struggling with financing, and as the head of the organization, it seems to me your biggest priority has to be that which makes you money, to help us get away from, or help us to go towards reforms, to help us be able to sell to our colleagues, these reforms are in place, they're going to focus on where they're going to make money, and not eliminate, not stop forever, but maybe you look at suspending some of these routes and saying, okay, we've got to turn the ship right, we've got to make sure we're focusing on the right things, and move forward on the Northeast Corridor, making sure it's right, to provide those revenues, to help us then move out, and I believe if you get the 10 or 12 corridors right in this country, organically, it'll grow back to continue to connect and be on the ground, because we are connected on the ground, from highways to parts of it in rail. But again, we've got to put the reforms in place. If we're ever going to get to where you want to get, where I want to get, where all of us want to get, we got to do it in a measured way and a step-by-step way. And I think that, again, focusing on where your profits are to me, should be the priority. The other thing, and you and I have had this conversation, the pricing that Amtrak does. On the Harrisburg to Philadelphia line, I've said this over and over, they don't charge enough. And look, nobody wants to pay more, but at the end of the day, if you're getting value for it, you will pay more. For me to go from Harrisburg to Philadelphia, $29, I'll pay more than that. I just sent my son from Harrisburg to New York City, round trip, $108. I mean, I was fully expecting to pay $200, because when I do the calculation of car, tolls, gas, headache, in traffic, $108, the value is much more than that. So again, and I'm going to continue to talk about this, not only the state of Pennsylvania that determines what the price of a ticket is from Harrisburg to Philadelphia, but also the Northeast Corridor. We need to look at this pricing and value. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for keeping me under control.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have largely been agreeing on everything today, and I'm going to change that now. The chairman of the full committee just said we have to look at the reality of the world. We're struggling for funding. We're indeed struggling for funding, but that's entirely a political construct. The fact of the matter is we are spending on infrastructure a fraction of what we should be spending. We're sitting here talking about tough choices within a very limited framework, and a framework that's limited in developing the economic potential of the country, and that's going to help destroy our competitiveness with foreign countries. We can borrow money at negative interest rates right now. Negative interest rates. People are paying us to take their money. We ought to be we ought to be borrowing a lot of money and spending it on infrastructure. We ought to be tripling and quadrupling and quintupling our investments here, and spread our horizons. We were spending 30, 40 years ago. We were spending about 3.5% of GDP on infrastructure. Now we're spending under 1% on infrastructure. China's spending 9% on infrastructure, and guess who's going to have a more efficient, competitive economy 20 years from now? So, yes, for the moment, until probably another couple of elections, we are in a rather foolish economic world in which we're not investing the money we ought to be investing, and I say investing, not spending, but investing the money that we ought to be investing in infrastructure. We ought to be doing the entire cost of high-speed rail in the Northeast Corridor, bringing the corridor up to snuff, and investing in high-speed rail, and doing it in California, and having a national system so that we can develop the economy of the country for its increasing population and for staying competitive with the Chinas of the world that we're not going to be competitive with if they keep investing 9% of GDP in infrastructure. We're investing under 1% of GDP. We can't maintain the systems we have. Reference was made that in the 20th century or the early part of the 20th century we had plenty of money, we're investing in infrastructure. Now we don't. Why did we have plenty of money? Simply because we're a positive feedback loop. We invested, the economy grew, we invested. Now we're going into a negative feedback loop where we're not investing, the economy isn't growing nearly as fast. So we have to discuss much of what we've been spending our time discussing, namely how to prioritize within a very narrow, short-sighted economic vision But we also ought to be discussing how to get out of that very narrow, short-sighted economic vision and eliminate this nonsense with austerity and these budget cuts and start really investing again. Having said all that, let me ask Mr. Yaro, what's your view on developing a transportation trust fund or an infrastructure bank to provide dedicated funding from the federal government for Amtrak, for development of high-speed intercity passenger rail? How would that impact private investment?
Well, I think we should do that, and I think
And
we
how would we
should.
fund such an infrastructure bank?
Well, as I said earlier, I've been a skeptic on P3s simply because it's actually cheaper to do tax exempt bonds and to finance projects that way. Private investors will want a return on their investment. They'll be looking for 4, 5, 6, at least 6% from pension funds, higher than that from other investors. But I'm coming around to the idea, and Felix Rowan's been very helpful to me on this, is that even though it would cost more, if that's what it takes to develop the political will to move ahead with a
In other words, that extra cost is the price we pay for lack of proper political will?
Well, I'm just saying, going back to your earlier statement, most of the infrastructure that we built in the 19th and 20th century was built with private investments. Federal government primed the pump. Federal government provided, usually in the West, it was land grants. In your part of the country, it was land grants to get the railroads to make those investments in the Southern Pacific, Union Pacific, and the rest of them, and so forth. But in other parts of the country, we had other federal incentives. It was mostly European investors who put money into first canals and then into railroads and so forth. And I think we can do that again and attract the kind of capital that you're talking about here. Understand that it's going to cost a little more to do it that way, but if that's what it takes to make these investments, you get it all back if you create new productive capacity, and if we create the kind of economic growth that the country should have and that we need to provide to our kids. And more than makes up for the difference, I think, in the additional cost of capital. So one way or another, let's find the political will to make these investments. So I've come around to the notion that if we need to do P3s to build bipartisan support for making these investments, by God, let's go ahead and do it.
Well, Mr. Nadler's correct. We do have a disagreement on this one. I agreed with the president 5 years ago when he said $9 trillion debt is un-American. Now we're double that. We haven't had a budget in 5 years now. We have some big challenges ahead of us. But I think where we all agree is finding a dedicated funding stream to make sure that these ongoing projects happen every year so that we don't have this huge backlog like we have today, where we're not only prioritizing projects, but we're really in a situation where our bridges across the nation, some of them are falling apart, and rail, we've got some very, very outdated rail that could leave us with safety concerns as well. And so we've got to have that dedicated revenue stream. We're looking on that with the highway bill, evaluating the highway trust fund and how you create greater revenues to be able to fully fulfill that. We need to do the same thing on rail. We need to put the cost controls in to make sure that the projects happen not only on time but on budget. And then ultimately, we've got to figure out how we're going to come up with this money so that we can continue to not only improve infrastructure, but really build high-speed rail and do it in the right way where we've got these public-private partnerships. While we're talking about the contracts and making sure that these are happening, Mr. Boardman, have you seen the Tudor-Perini contract? I'm sorry, the California High-Speed Rail initial segment funding contract?
I have not seen the contract, no.
Okay. When you put together a contract on a new asset improvement, when you do a contract with a public-private partnership, or even a contract with a builder, if you're doing a design build, do you not have the cost controls in place to make sure that it happens on time? If it doesn't happen on time, there's penalties, and as well, making sure that there's a guarantee so that there aren't a bunch of add-ons at the end?
We generally have that, yes.
Thank you. We couldn't get an answer on that last week on the California high-speed rail issue, so the contracting left me concerned about this first phase getting done on time and on budget. Ms. McDonald, as the former chairwoman of the Northeast Corridor Commission, what are some of the concerns that states have when being asked to invest their own funds in Amtrak infrastructure?
You know, I think as we've been talking this morning, first and foremost, the collaboration between the states and D.C. is better than it's ever been. Second of all,
We appreciate that.
thank you, and we appreciate your support along those lines as well. You know, I think the point that you just highlighted with Joe is different states have different procurement policies, and it's really making sure that the dialogue is with Amtrak to make sure that we are using the best procurement method available to us, and when I say us, it's us collectively, and the hurdle of getting the work done, well, not only Amtrak is operating trains, but Metro North is operating trains, New Jersey Transit, MARC, everybody's operating trains. The windows to get the work done are very tight, and it's working through some of those to make sure we get the work done.
And what are some of the steps that you take or have taken to mitigate those concerns?
Well, what we've done with Amtrak and with CSX on the Hudson line, which is our equivalent of the Pennsylvania line, is we have several agreements, and they have their operating agreements, capital agreements. We have in place for that line a capital construction committee, which consists of New York State DOT, Amtrak, and CSX, and we do prioritize, and we very closely track how the projects are progressing and where the potential cost overruns could be, and what are the risk mitigation measures that we can put in place.
Thank you. Ms. Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The last time I was in a similar hearing, Mayor Bloomberg was here and former Pennsylvania Governor Ed Rendell was here, and the discussion was the same. You were here at that meeting, and let's just be clear. Without long distance, Amtrak would be a commuter rail. There would be no connectivity between the East Coast and the West Coast, and currently, 4 states have no passenger rail service without long distance. 23 states, 4 million people would be without any service whatsoever. We're talking about air, passenger, bus service, air, or rail. So, I mean, to discuss that we want to do away with long distance service, it's like saying that we want to do away with the mail system. I mean, basically, we have a lot of people that are not thinking forward. And transportation used to be the engine that put American people to work. We haven't had a WRDA bill in 7 years. That's the bill that fund the ports and the Coast Guard. So, I mean, we are really, for the first time, I feel that we're beginning to move forward on some of the transportation issues that would actually put the American people to work. Sadly, for the first time, I've found people that I don't think believe in putting the American people to work. They are just very backward. No one here, I'm sure. But I would like to know, what will your recommendations be for the Passenger Rail Investment Improvement Act, starting with Mr. Boardman?
For the reauthorization of the act?
Yes. What would be your recommendation?
We need funding to maintain our railroad, and we need it on a multi-year basis.
Dedicated funding.
Yes.
All right. Mr. Fry?
I would second that, and I'm not deep into this, but I think the way Joe has articulated all of this, the way Joe has articulated this in terms of first things first, I would support his position as well.
Okay. Ms. McDonald?
I would agree, and as I mentioned earlier when I said that New York State has invested over a 30-year period, $22 billion in its commuter railroads. One of the issues that we're grappling with on the commission is how do we deal with states that have made prior investments and kept their state of good repair up to date, and Amtrak is not. Is there a credit for that? Isn't there a credit for that? So to answer your question and also to answer your question, Congressman Denham, the states have stepped up to the plate. And we believe that the federal government and Amtrak also need to step up to the plate to make those deferred capital investments so that we can move forward and create jobs.
What about those 53 miles that I think they go through New York, that if we could speed those up, that would improve the system?
Connecticut.
Is that Connecticut? That's not you?
Mostly Connecticut.
It's mostly Connecticut, yeah.
Okay. Mhm. Yes, sir, Ms. Yaro.
It's owned by Connecticut DOT. I would add a couple of things. First, the notion of getting dedicated funding, getting Amtrak into a trust fund type of arrangement, the way the rest of the system operates. And then I think there's an opportunity here to be thinking about I'll call it high-speed rail version 2.0. Where strategic investments in the Northeast, I think in California, finding the right place for the federal government to invest in the California system, and then a series of others. Florida, the all aboard. There's a new generation of projects all aboard Florida, which is going to require grade separations, some right-of-way acquisition to get to Orlando. The Dallas to Houston project, same thing. There's a public role in getting, even though it's mostly private investment, there's public money that's required for grade separations and other investments. Same thing in the Midwest, in Chicago to Milwaukee and on to Minneapolis and so forth. Desert Express. So I think there's an opportunity here for the committee to think about what an effective intercity and high-speed rail program could be across the entire country. Obviously, we're partisan about the Northeast, and that this is probably the greatest need right here in the Northeast, just to make the investments that we've been talking about here today. But there are projects around the country, in fact, that make sense. That in fact there are opportunities for P3s and in all of them. Thank you.
Florida would have been #1 in high speed in the country if we've not started with Jeb Bush sending the first money back, and then with this present governor sending $3 billion back that the legislature had voted for, the taxpayers had voted for. I mean, and when I went to Utah, they're riding with our money, and of course you all are enjoying it here. Yeah, I know it. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Let me just say that, let me ask the following question. Mr. Boardman first. Let's talk about the infrastructure bank. There's also the transportation trust fund that's been suggested. I'm not sure what the difference is. Do you support the infrastructure bank proposal? How big should it be? The President proposed, I think, $60 billion at one point. And how should it be funded?
Well, I got to tell you, I'm the worst guy in the world to be up here talking about what the policies ought to be for how we raise the funds and what we need to do. That's not my stick.
Okay.
But I got to tell you that we need the money. We need it in a multi-year basis. And I think that's what we appeal to you to make a decision for.
Let me ask, I'll ask the other members of the panel in a moment the same question, but let me ask you a specific question. In 1981, I think it was, the state legislature in New York passed something called contract bonds, in which we floated $800 million which the MTA floated $800 million of bonds against a promise by the legislature to appropriate funding for debt service for the next 30 years. Is that a concept that you think would work on the federal level?
I honestly do not know.
Commissioner McDonald, for both the questions.
I do think there needs to be a dedicated transportation fund / infrastructure bank. I think the, part of what we've all gotten used to is pay as you go. We get the money and then we spend it on projects. The TIFIA loan program, the RIF program, allow us to look at it differently, and I think future federal dollars should be allowable to pay back a RIF or a TIF, regardless of which mode you're in. I think every revenue option should be on the table. Congresswoman Brown mentioned Governor Rendell, and Monday or Tuesday morning on Morning Joe, there was a big discussion about the offshore assets of U.S. companies, and he said, you change the federal corporate tax code, and then you get some of those offshore assets back, and you put them into the infrastructure bank, and I think that would be worth exploring.
Let me just say that I am vehemently opposed to that proposal.
Okay.
Because we should not be bribing our companies to pay their taxes. We should mandate that they do so, and that they regular rate, not at 5% or whatever, because they'll just not pay their taxes the next 20 years, expecting another amnesty like that. There have got to be better ways of funding infrastructure.
He wasn't talking about an amnesty. He was talking about a permanent change to the tax code. So,
Even worse,
so I
but
think,
go ahead.
but anyway, but that's one example that needs. But here we have a difference of opinion, and we're generally on the same page in some of these things. But it's looking at every revenue option to put into the bank and into the trust fund. And
How
I do.
big should how big should an infrastructure bank be? Order of magnitude.
Back when President Obama proposed the Yaro program, and I was in Connecticut, Dick Levin, who was the president of Yale, said that we needed to put, over $100 billion into infrastructure investment, which is transportation, water, wastewater, utility. There's a huge need.
Mr. Yaro?
Connect the dots between these the different questions here. And one is that PREA required that the Federal Railroad Administration complete a national rail plan. There was a draft plan, they never finalized it, and I got to I won't comment on why it wasn't finished, but it hasn't been finished. The Congress needs, I think, and what the country needs is an agreed upon vision for the systems of investments that we need to make in roads and rails, aviation, waterways, and so forth. We're all talking about a set of depreciating assets at the moment that will not sustain our standard of living, our competitiveness in coming decades. So let's see if we can agree on a plan, on a map and so forth that shows where these improvements need to be and so forth. And then I think we need to tote up what it's going to cost, and then we need to find the political will. Both public and private investments, states need to participate, federal government needs to incentivize the states to participate and to invest in these things as it always has. This is as old as the Republic. George Washington insisted on getting the Interstate Commerce Clause in the Constitution because before he became president, he put together the C&O Canal, couldn't get the states of Maryland and Virginia to cooperate, insisted that the federal government play a role in incentivizing, planning, leading on infrastructure investments. I think that's what's needed, and I think it would be a wonderful thing, in fact, if this committee could come forward with that kind of approach.
Last thing, if you think about it, we have in the water, we have the money there, but it's just sitting there, and they just let it sit there and look at the deficit as opposed to using it. So one of the things is we develop some infrastructure bank. We've got to make sure that we use it for the purpose we're talking about. It should be a direct user fee and some way to get it out in the system, because we have billions of dollars in the harbor maintenance tax that we've collected, but we're not using it for that purpose. So it's not just setting up the funds, but we need a system that we get it out. And just like the what's the fund, the typical loan, it is, we have the authority, but it just sits there and we're not using it. RIF just sits there. It has $35 billion that we have the authority to use, and I don't think we've used $1 billion. And so I yield back the balance of my time, but thank you all so much for your presentation. We all know the problem, how can we work together to move the issue forward. Thank you again.
Again, thank you, each of you, for your testimony. This has been a very educational trip. Coming from California, I don't always get a chance to come up the Northeast Corridor, and certainly don't get the opportunity to really see some of the challenges that you have to deal with every day, from the S-turns to the horseshoe turns, and a lot of the upgrades that need to happen. And we're committed as a committee not only to getting the passenger reauthorization bill done, but to working with you to address all of these challenges. And that's going to be a commitment that we're going to have to share with the states, as well as public-private partnerships. As we look at rail across the nation, we need those public-private partnerships. If you're going to have an economic benefit by establishing businesses around a stop, then we want the private companies to be able to come in and help us with that as well as the states. And we're only going to be able to get this plan if we not only work together, but also manage it ongoing together, so we don't have cost overruns, so we don't have time delays, and we have good contracts negotiated. So we certainly want to work with you on all of that. We're looking forward to improving not only rail, but we're looking at the future vision of high-speed rail. But we've got to do it right, and we're committed to working together to make that happen. So again, thank you for your testimony today. If there are no further questions, I'd ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing, and unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. I'd like to thank our witnesses again today for their testimony.